Hey, it's Kayla. I'm going to be talking about the cognitive functions, particularly in the intuitive types, I guess, also the sensors, but sort of to say like why I think it's harder, I guess, to go off of that when you're talking about intuitives, and well, why it's easier to go off of that when talking about sensors. I would say sensors, and like based on the temperaments, you would say that an SP and an SJ would be defined very much by their preference to extroverted sensing and introverted sensing. All SPs share the preference for extroverted sensing, whereas all SJs share the preference for introverted sensing. As an intuitive, both groups could have one other type who share all of our functions, and then we have two who share no cognitive functions with us, and maybe it's not as important to divide us in that way. Maybe it's not what defines us. I would say what defines us is our preference for logic or our preference for feeling. And intuitives are, we're a lot less than the sensors, meaning just that they're a lot more common, whereas in the type community, it's an interest of many intuitives. So you'll see a lot more intuitives. Let's just say somebody who has never heard of type and doesn't really know anything about it, if they were to look at YouTube videos and forums, then they would, without any knowledge of what actually a sensor and intuitive is, and they just saw how many intuitives are on and how many sensors, they would probably guess that intuitives were the more common type of person. I mean, so most of the people who use this are intuitives, and I don't feel like we really define ourselves as much using, the specific cognitive functions. We more so define ourselves in different ways, and I also would say that just being an intuitive, we would probably, just relate best to our own temperament, and then maybe not relating so much, but when listening to, let's say you're an NF, listening to an NT or an NT listening to an NF, it's still a lot easier to follow. Like when I'm listening to an NT, I might not fully understand everything, but it's easier to follow. I find them interesting to listen to. I mean, well, certain times when it gets into feelings and, you know, and teasing, every feeling and thought you have is really just a chemical, and there's a completely logical explanation for it. I'm just like, if that's the case, then there's no meaning to it. But for the most part, I do find NTs to be very interesting and like definitely better than somebody just naming 1,000,001 details that I'm not really sure how they're relevant, and asking me 1,000,001 details that I have to rack my brain for when I'm still not really sure of its relevance either. So I would say that, yeah, it's just, we're different. So then sensors, the cognitive functions, being an introverted sensor and extroverted sensor, mean a lot. And then at the same time, it's the same thing with us, as in the sensors aren't split up into, feelers and thinkers. So that might be harder when trying to gauge which preference they have of feeling or thinking. That might be harder to, guess with them, or not guess, but figure out, because that preference doesn't really define them in the same way that it does with the intuitives. And we're already like a lot less, so SJs and SPs, I find, are sometimes fascinated in the same way as NTs and NFs, just because a lot of times they say they give each other balance. But at the same time, there's like a lot more of them, so you might find more often than not than they do separate from those two groups. And they might find the other one just really hard to understand. I mean, to an SJ, this rebel, they see just this rebel, without really a cause, and why don't they just stay in line? And then the SP just sees this rigid SJ who just doesn't want to have fun. And the same thing I feel like would happen maybe sometimes with NTs and NFs, in a way where maybe to an NT we just seem illogical and just going purely on emotion and not taking reason into account, where as we might see the NTs is not caring as much, having emotion, and like I said before about the feeling things, but like in chemicals. But at the same time, it's like it's still our intuition we want to understand the unknown. We want to understand something like the deeper meaning. I think that's true for all intuitives. NFs with like the deeper, meaning just as far as feelings go and that sort of thing and emotions go, and we need to know that there's like a deeper meaning, and NTs the same thing, like a deeper understanding of like logic and reasoning, and we both would want to understand something that we don't already understand. So like just taking like our intuition, we still would want to understand, which is why I feel like comes in the fascination. Why I would be fascinated to understand something an NT was talking about. They might be fascinated to understand something an NF was talking about as well. And at the same time, just speaking about cognitive functions, I mean, like, we have a thinking function. I do as an ENFJ. It's weaker, and like I said, I feel like I'm only really trying to use it to understand something that I can't understand through my other functions, or if I'm trying to explain something to somebody else. But it's still there, and I still find listening to someone with introverted thinking interesting. And yeah, I guess just I'm gonna be making a video, not really sort of related to this, about just as an ENFJ, particularly what I would like feel about the other NFs, because it has been suggested to me by somebody, like that I was wrong about my functions, and I guess I'm gonna be talking just about that and how I see my functions and then the other functions, but they're all pretty much just, I'm just gonna be going into intuition and feeling. Okay, thanks for watching.